Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Paoli, editor, and I am pleased to be moderating our first session as well as welcoming you to our Enterprise Ransomware and Recovery Summit, brought to you by Rubrik. The editorial staff of Virtualization and Cloud Review and redmondmag.com have worked hard to bring together some of the best independent experts on this topic, so we really hope you enjoy it. Before we start today's event with these three great sessions, we do have some announcements. First, we wanted to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email with the replays available generally within the next few days. Each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you. During today's third session, we will be giving away a Rad Mission 1 electric hybrid bike, but you must be present to win. So be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsor Rubrik available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of Rubrik's underwriting of this content that we can bring you this summit. So we thank them for sponsoring and supporting the community and ask you to check out these resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Finally, I do want to mention before we begin that our Session 1 and Session 2 order for today's summit has changed. We will begin our second session of today's summit with expert advice, what to do if ransomware strikes you. This session features Dave Kawula, Managing Principal Consultant at Tricon Elite Consulting, and John O'Neill, Sr., Chief Technologist at AWS Solutions. Dave is a Microsoft MVP with over 20 years of experience in the IT industry. His background includes data communication networks with multi-server environments, and he has architecture teams for virtualization, System Center, Exchange, Active Directory, and Internet gateways. John is a chief technologist with more than 30 years in IT. John has worked as a consultant, architect, executive speaker, and author. He's been involved in multinational networking, messaging, and communication projects. He has also authored materials for Thomson Reuters Espator books and exec blueprints, and develops coursework for Plural Insights. Take it away, Dave and John.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. It's great to be here today. Dave and I are always excited when we can get together and talk with fellow IT pros. And this is a great topic. It's very relevant right now. Dave and I spend a lot of our time on it. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to you, Dave, because you always do the best introductions.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Thank you for everyone for attending today. And we're really pleased to be able to talk on this subject because, like John said, this is something that's so relevant in today's cybersecurity landscape. A couple of housekeeping notes that we have as we go through this session. In your attendee panel, you're going to see a Q&A option. And so please feel free to ask questions throughout the session. John and I will do our best to answer them live throughout the session. And we'll also be taking questions at the end. And we'd also like to thank our sponsor, Rubrik, for this event, because without them, this wouldn't be possible. So thank you to the sponsors. And with that, John, let's get rolling with this.
Great,
okay.
Dave.
So I always lead off with this story, John, and you and I have been part of so many ransomware recovery teams, and the one thing that I have to point out is that ransomware, when it strikes an organization, is all-encompassing, and the impact is just so wide, especially for organizations that encounter whole-level ransomware attacks where pretty much the entire network is shut down. You've all picked up the newspaper or checked the internet and saw feeds with, local hospitals shut down or local universities shut down. And specifically with healthcare, that could mean that the operating theaters aren't running anymore because they need access to those systems. They could be having to transfer patients. They could be having to do a lot of that. And so my number one tip for everyone here, the first one that we'll talk about, is isolating the impact of, where ransomware is hitting. And so this one is so critical. And timing is really of the essence for this one, John, because the longer that you leave it running rampant on your network, the more damage it's going to do. That's the way it's designed. once it gains access to an insecure service account that has elevated permissions, it's going to go start scouring the network to try to find anything that it can attach to. And in a lot of cases, there is a sophisticated method to this where, you think that, oh, well, the bad guy's getting into every single system and he's manually clicking the buttons. No, they're scripting this. So they're basically dropping scripts that are executing on behalf of the credentials that they've been able to compromise and executing it on those behalfs. So if you're really lucky, maybe it's just a user-based attack where you follow the principle of least privilege and that user's not an administrator on their device, but they probably have read-write access to file servers. So any of their map drives that they have could be impacted. Maybe their OneDrive is impacted. Maybe some of the SharePoint sites are impacted. But the big thing here, John, that I think we have to get started with is that it's Monday morning and you just got the panic phone call that something is wrong on the network. What do we do? What's that first thing that we should think about?
Well, Dave, I've spent the last decade pretty much focused on being a CISO or CIO, and critical to that was developing the strategy we use now, which is we isolate immediately, then we analyze, then we determine the course of action and remediation, and if it's a false positive, so be it, then we un-isolate. But it's a very important shift from the way we used to do it and that many IT professionals are comfortable with. They want to take a look and dig in and understand what's really going on before they take action. And I remind everybody that our strategy now is that we would rather have a few minutes or even hours of downtime than days and weeks, right? Or a lot of times now it's measured in months. That's non-survivable. Minutes and hours are survivable. But I will mention this, Dave, and then I'm going to let you throw in some thoughts because I know you got some really great ones on this topic, is that the key to being able to do that is to early on have communication with senior leaders, executives, that kind of thing, to let them understand clearly. I mean, don't butter it up and polish it up or whatever. Let them understand clearly that, hey, we've got all these advanced threat protection systems and monitoring and teammates that are watching, and when we see something that looks anomalous, we're going to isolate, then we're going to analyze, then we'll take action and go on from there. Because if you do that before an event, and they know that's what the process is, and it's been communicated down from them to other leaders, you will eliminate most of the things that you're worried about where people are going to come back and bash on you and all that, because you had leadership's engagement from the start. So, Dave, what are your thoughts?
Well, here's an interesting one, John, just to kind of toss around here, is that I actually have some of my friends that work in IT, and their bonuses are actually tied. So they're sysadmins, and their bonuses are actually tied to uptime. And so when I look at point number 3, consider shutting everything down, that could be an immediate impact on their bonus structure that they have. So they might be a little tentative to do that. So a big piece of advice here is that in today's landscape, shutting everything down when you potentially have a compromise that's coming in flight is not the wrong thing to do. Turning off the edge firewalls and the gateway to prevent any internet access, because that's how the bad guy's getting in, is not necessarily the wrong thing to do. Yes, you're going to impact the business in a great way, but you can understand from the IT pro's perspective, that could be a significant monetary loss for them personally. And what I'm suggesting is that if you're in this boat, you should be having a conversation with your senior leadership, and you should be changing your salary structure, because it doesn't work like that anymore. If an event happens, we're shutting it down. We're isolating right now. It doesn't matter what it is. Okay, so that's just a kind of little cold nugget for you. And I was actually thinking about that as I was going through and building this content with you, John. The other thing is if you think that there is a breach, one of the things that I know is very difficult for a lot of organizations is getting that password policy updated, changing passwords on service accounts, not letting service accounts log in interactively. Listen, I know that if you do a mass password reset, you're going to break stuff. We can all clearly admit that. But you know what, John? The first time you do it, and we've had to do this, it's going to be painful. But the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth time you have to go through that mass password reset, you're documenting along the way saying, oh, wow, I didn't even know that web server hooked into this SQL server using this account. We're gaining back some of that knowledge in IT that might have been lost with, some of the projects or transitions or other things that are happening. So we know that that's potentially going to be painful. But once you have to go through this the first time, document. And the other thing, the intangible here is that don't leave default passwords on any of your IPMI, IDRAC, ILO, those out-of-band management interfaces that you have to get into your servers. Because what can end up happening there is that now somebody has basically host-level access to your servers, and they could just hit the power button. They could flash the firmware on there, and they could brick those devices to make them so that they're not even bootable anymore. And so, yeah, don't forget about that. And also consider running that on isolated networks as well so that they're not visible to the general populace that's out there. Okay. So the next thing is, John, we've had the attack. Okay, so we're modeling this scenario. The attack has happened, and it's in flight right now. Well, you're probably the single biggest expert on cyber insurance that I know. Like you review those policies as part of your day job. You're the only person I know that likes actually reading cover-to-cover cyber insurance policies. But my question for you is, and from my review, and I'm nowhere as deep as you are, from my review on this, is that inside of that policy, in about the middle of that policy, there's in the event of an incident, follow this procedure. And there's a phone number that you have to call, an emergency phone number. There's an emergency email notification. And it's kind of like what I consider like the bat phone. And so when that happens, what happens with that cyber insurance vendor? Do they actively get engaged with us? Do they bring in resources? Can they help us? What happens inside that policy? So you're covered. You've got cyber insurance. Great. Now you have to notify the cyber insurance vendor. What happens next?
Well, thanks, Dave. And I don't know. Like might be a little strong word there, but I feel that it's important and relevant. So you're absolutely right. I spend an inordinate amount of time digging in the details, analyzing claims that are being made, how insurance carriers, underwriters are handling them, what they're doing, and that sort of thing. And so there's a few tips I'm going to give everyone out there. First off, stop thinking of your cybersecurity policy the way you think of your other policies. When you have a fire that wipes out your building, the policy acts and reacts in a very specific way and pays out, and it's all good, okay? It's 100% loss, it's 50% loss, whatever it is. In a cyber incident policy in 2022, you're looking at something that they have a much more difficult time defining how the attacker got in, what they did, that sort of thing. So they are requiring, as part of your policy, that if you expect to get any money from them, that you're going to allow them to lead the forensics after the event, okay? And this doesn't mean once you're back up and running and your business is going or whatever, you're going to be required to call and notify them. You're going to be required to engage with the resources that they define. So that's tip 2. If you have security vendors that you think these are the people we're going to bring in when an event happens and they're going to help us, your insurance company, if that vendor isn't on their list, may lock them out, may tell you they cannot participate. If they do, well, then we're not going to pay you and it's on you. So my advice to you there is find out what that list is from your insurance carrier And if your preferred vendor isn't on there, get them on there, because your insurance carrier will add resources, and that might even bring some other business, your partner's way. But you need to do that in advance, not while you're trying to deal with an outage. And number 3, the insurance carrier and the lawyers and the analysts and everything else, they are not nearly as motivated as you are to interrupt the business loss that you're incurring and get you back up to where you're at full revenue generation or operational status, if you will. They are motivated, and the insurance company particularly, if you have riders in there that give you business continuation coverage and things like that, but those tend to have smaller limits and other things, but there's details in there, and you're going to probably feel a little frustration where you want things to go a different way, and you're going to have to follow what they say. And the final thing that I'm going to really mention here is that if you think your cyber insurance policy is just going to pay when you have an event, if it's a $4 million event, that they're just going to write a check for $4 million, they're not. They're going to do their analysis and everything else. And I can tell you, I just reviewed a couple cases recently where the insurance carrier is refusing to pay and going to court over the fact that the covered person, the covered party, claimed that they had MFA on all accounts, and the forensics showed that they did not. And so therefore the insurance carrier says you didn't meet the terms necessary to issue the policy, so therefore we're not paying out on the policy. And the problem now is that the expense, without the insurance coverage, the expense that the organization incurred looks so high that there's some question if they're going to survive. So all those employees, all that business is pretty much at risk of not coming back at all. So whatever it is you have to attest to or state that you're going to do to get that insurance policy, don't just rubber stamp it. They're going to come in and they're going to do forensics, and they're going to find out, and it's going to impact whether or not you get paid. And I can tell you that I would never, as an IT pro, want to look at the business and say, yeah, I signed off that we had that, and we really didn't have that, and so I'm now the reason that we're not getting our payout on that policy. That's just not a place I ever want to be. Be open, transparent, and upfront.
Awesome, John. You know, your advice is just so relevant for anybody having to, go through this exercise. The other thing, another little nugget for everybody: insurance policies have a deductible. Okay, and so if you have a $10 million policy, you have a 10% deductible. That's $1 million. That $1 million has to be paid up front. So that's not something where you're just going to go to cyber insurance and they're just going to start cutting you checks. You have to pay that deductible up front, almost in a similar way that you would for like car insurance. It's just the deductible is much, much higher from a dollar perspective. And so I don't know of a lot of organizations that have set up a cyber insurance slush fund to cover that cost, because in the event that your business is down and you're not generating revenue, heading off to your financial business partners and saying, hey, we need to take it and have another $1 million here so that we can invoke our cyber insurance is going to further delay things. I'm not saying you can't get it, but I'm just going to say that, it's not going to be something that you're going to get overnight. And so right. I hope that you've got funds set aside for that.
Yeah, and Dave, that's a great point, right? If you're ransomed and you can't generate revenue, you now have employees and partners, bills to pay, and all these things with no income coming in. So obviously you want to get that ransomware unlocked or undone as fast as you can. Well, often you may have to pay the ransom up front and get reimbursed by the insurance company. So you can even be talking about a bigger number than the deductible, right? And if you don't pay it, there's a fixed amount of time where you can run without being able to bring in revenue, and eventually people start getting laid off and bills get overdue and that kind of thing. So like you said, Dave, that is such great advice. The business should decide on, the number that they need to carry them through while insurance works its way out, and then get that in some sort of, retained account so that it's ready to go when you need it.
And one more point along this, John, is the fact that if you're in a situation where you do have to pay, there's typically a time inside of any of those ransom notes that say 48 hours to make up the month. Otherwise, we're going to permanently delete your files or whatever. There's some mechanism triggering event inside of there. And so if you can't figure out a recovery strategy, that might be your only path to, survivability. And now you say, okay, fine, we're going to pay the bad guys. And so you wire transfer money over to the lawyers that are involved, your cyber insurance vendor. Then they have brokerage firms that go and deal with the negotiators that go through, and that money changes hands several times. That doesn't happen overnight, John. The last time that this happened to an organization I was dealing with, it took 4 days for that money to finally get its way to the bad guy before we got a key back. And then by the time we got the key back, it was actually a slow decryption process. It took another 3 days to decrypt data. Then when we decrypted data, we got the data only back because it blew up all of the OS drives on all of our servers. So here's your SQL data back, but no SQL server. I hope. So just because you pay doesn't necessarily mean it's a magic fix to get you back. You're going to get data back, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're back up and running and operational. Okay, so John, you talked about a communication strategy for this suite. And so I always go back to this, is that cyber DR is not the same as traditional DR. You're in the middle of an event. Traditional DR, power outages, snowstorms, whatever it is. Something has taken your physical infrastructure out, but for the most part, maybe your physical infrastructure might still be safe and salvageable. That's not the same for cyber DR. Somebody is actively trying to go destroy everything that you've worked so hard to build. And so when communicating this with the C-suite, that communication strategy, and actually one of the things I really recommend here, and then I'll hand this back over to you, John, is pre-crafting those emails that you have in the event of an emergency, because it's really hard to write those when you're in a panic situation, okay? Hello, Mr. CEO. We understand that this is a very troubling exercise right now, but please understand we have the world's top leading forensic experts on this. We anticipate that we're going to see something happening within the next couple hours. We will provide status updates to you every 2 hours. And, here's contact information and details. Now, remember, emailing that might not be possible, because what if email is down? That DR playbook needs to be stored somewhere that is available in the event of a network outage. So please do not just store that on your SharePoint site, because if you have no authentication to get there, how are you supposed to pull that down with the contact list? That DR playbook needs to be printed, pen and paper, put somewhere where you can go get it. Break glass in the data center in the event that this happens. Look at this book. Right? All right. So quick thoughts on this one, John.
So you're absolutely right about that, Dave. And that made me think of a topic we're going to get to here in the next couple of slides on break glass account for your hybrid tenants and that kind of thing. Those break glass scenarios are no more evident than in a cyber DR event, right? Because you're literally locked out of everything in many cases, and nothing is safe. So it isn't like you can turn it on quickly and get in there and get what you need and get out. No, it's off limits. So if you don't have it printed and available, then you've got to do it off memory, and that's never great under pressure, and that's just not the way to go. But the main thought that I wanted to get across on this slide is that you should be communicating with your C-suite regularly in advance of anything. Like right now, try and work with them to get time on their calendars, once a month or at least every 6 weeks or so, to just kind of give them a state of the union of what you're seeing, like things that you're maybe picking up or learning here in this session, or news reports or that kind of thing, so that they understand the environment that the organization is operating in, first off, and then also, keep reinforcing to them what your cyber DR plan is, right? What your business continuity plans are, that kind of thing. Not in detail. This is high-level stuff, but what it does is it prepares them to kind of trust you and stay off your back when you're trying to focus on the event, right? Because if you haven't had these discussions in advance and they're in, dire straits, no revenue, maybe they're about to shut down customers. We had that cyber event that took out a supplier to Toyota that caused Toyota to lose production of 13,000 vehicles. Okay, when you're an executive and you're facing that kind of loss, you want to really be in there asking what's going on and that sort of thing. Well, if you've got that pre-knowledge base built and communicated in that relationship, they will trust you and they will stay off your back until the next status update comes. And as you put right on the slide, do that in couple-hour increments. And then another tip I would say is assign a specific member of the team to do that. Now, if you're a one-person shop, then obviously that's more difficult. But if you have the option to have a specific member of the team, maybe one that doesn't have as much responsibility for the actual technical recovery and that sort of thing, assign them as the communications manager, right? And they will be the one that relay updates and that sort of thing. It can go a great way to helping you navigate the stress of the event, because it is a whole lot of stress.
All right, John, we've got a question that came in here, and it's a really good one. Should we be paying the bad guys in the first place? If we do, aren't we facilitating the bad guys? And how many times are we going to have to pay them? That's just a fantastic question, because that's the crux that you're in, is that if you have a solid recovery strategy, if you have immutable backups, you have the ability to basically greenfield, wipe and reload everything and hopefully, get back to a point in time where it's stable state where, the bad guys haven't gotten in there. But if there's bad practices and holes in your infrastructure, you could restore that and they could just find their way right back in. And what I found is that, if you don't pay, they're gonna be trying to come back in. So it's only a matter of time. Now, with that, you have to really watch sanctioning and stuff like that, because you may not even have an option to pay. But you and I had that scenario last year with that customer up in Canada, John, where all of the backups were compromised, all of the servers were compromised, all of the desktops were compromised, and they had hundreds of millions of dollars sitting there in bids and engineering stuff that they were working through, and they couldn't access it. And so really they had no choice. If they didn't pay, if they didn't go through that process, there was no recoverability for them. And it wasn't a huge organization. So the choice was, don't pay, go out of business. Pay, maybe survive. That was their choice that they had. So it's not as simple as just wanting to not pay or not wanting to pay. Sometimes you have no choice but to head down that road. And we try to provide organizations with options so that, you don't have to pay the bad guys and go through that. But it all depends on how far along, you've come with, your cyber defenses and strategies with that. So great question.
This is absolutely where that open and honest, transparent communication comes in, because the business has to make the decision. Like you said, if not paying the ransom means we're done, we go out of business, everybody loses their jobs, our customers go somewhere else. I mean, that's obviously not the choice anyone's going to make. So the reason you have to be open and honest and transparent is because you need to be communicating to the C-suite and saying, look, if we don't pay this and I have to rebuild every server and every workstation from scratch, I can prioritize it and get, the the distribution section up and running so that we're moving product again or whatever, but that's going to take a week, right? It's like you said, where you talked about that it took 4 days to move the money and then another 3 days to rebuild things. That's 7 days. You need to be open and honest on that so that the business can decide what is the total loss to the business in that 7 days, and that's how they'll make the decision. What you don't want to do is tell them it'll take 1 day and they make a decision to not pay the ransom, and then you come back and go, oops, I was wrong, it's going to take 7 days, because you could have just cost the company, so to speak.
All right, John, we got one more really good question that came in, then we'll move on here. When in the process of recovery or prevention, do you involve government agencies? And so I can speak to Canada, and then I'll let you speak to U.S. because that's where we live. So in Canada, it depends on the size of the organization that you are, but if there's any thought or loss of any personal or private information that has gone out the door with said ransom attack, and normally that's 100% of the case, because if they ransomed your files, typically they had an upload mechanism to exfiltrate a bunch of your data. And what they're looking for is like accounting shares and, that personal and private information. So in Canada, it's called the Privacy Commissioner. And so with the Privacy Commissioner, they'll guide us as to the next step. And we can contact our local agency, which would be kind of equivalent of the FBI in the U.S., which would be the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And so the answer is yes. Typically, if it's bad and you're under attack like that, because it could be a targeted attack towards either an individual in your organization or towards the entire organization itself. And so you want to find out that this isn't just like a spray and pray type attack where somebody opened a phishing email and something came in and they escalated and they gained access, or was this a targeted attack? Was this a sophisticated hack? Because if it was a targeted and sophisticated type attack, odds are that there's a good chance that they're going to potentially come back. And, that actually leads up to a really good point here, which is, starting restores and going down that process can actually trigger escalations with the bad guys. And so that's where your cyber insurance vendors from the previous slide will help out, and they'll guide you through that process to make sure you follow everything. So in the U.S., what happens, John? Let's say today, you're working at an organization and you get clobbered. Like everything is offline, and they're printing ransom notes on all the printers, and you've had to send all your employees home. Is that the time that you're notifying federal agencies, right, John?
Absolutely. The recommendation I tell everyone is to have a plan to notify your lawyers in addition to the cyber insurance, because they're not one and the same. These are two different needs and two different tactics. So your insurance company isn't necessarily going to do the notifications that you need to do and that sort of thing. In the U.S., you've got federal requirements, and then you've got state requirements. So for federal, it's fairly straightforward. Notify the FBI. That is where the cybersecurity division for breaches and ransomware typically lives. So you notify them, the local field office. You can get their number off the web or whatnot. But this is what, if you have a lawyer, you ask them to take care of it, because then you also have state regulations that you have to comply with. As you were mentioning, Dave, if employee personally identifiable information, or PII, is exposed, and you have to assume it is exposed in a breach like this, in a ransomware event, then you have legal responsibilities to notify each and every one of those people, and you have a certain time frame to do it within, right? And depending on the size of the breach and that sort of thing, these things can result in class action suits and all sorts of different stuff. So that's why I suggest to everyone, no matter the size of the event, go ahead and notify the FBI. It doesn't cost anything, and it's a phone call. And engage your lawyer to tell you whether there are any local state regulations or that sort of thing that you have to deal in. If you take the tactic of, I don't want to say anything because I don't want the bad publicity, I don't want people to come back or whatever, trust me, it almost always comes back, and you will be in far worse shape, not just from like what we were talking about with class action suits and that sort of thing, but there can actually be some legal ramifications from the government. And the final thing I'm going to mention, Dave, is at least in the U.S., your obligation to report is not just based on the size of the attack or the amount of information that was exposed. It can be based upon where the source of the attack came from. So, for instance, if you realize that the attack came from Russia, South Sudan, any of these countries that are on a very specific watch list with a higher risk level, there's some notification requirements there as far as the law goes. So the short of it is, anything happens, notify.
Awesome. What a great question. Thank you very much for that question, Victor. Okay, so John, we've got a lot more great content to cover here. And so now you've been attacked, you've notified cyber insurance vendors, you've gone through the process of notifying the C-suite. Now we're going to evaluate, what our recovery options are that we have. So first question is, do you have air-gap backups? And by air-gap backups, I mean something that's offline. Okay, so think about, the old tape media, or you could have rotational USB media or offline target servers, things like that. Make sure that you've got one of those offline, because in the event you have a whole level ransomware attack and the choice is going out of business or paying the bad guys, trust me, you are going to be very thankful that you even have a backup that's a week or a month old. You can rekey that data. You can't rebuild your entire organization. So even if it's old, you're going to be glad you have something, okay? The next thing is that threat actors actively target backup infrastructure. So what they want to do is they want to get their hands on that backup data and destroy it as quickly as possible, because that removes your capabilities of being able to recover. So immutability to me is going back to the good old days of floppy disks or tape backups, where you had a little tab, or you could break off a tab on your tape and you could turn that tape into read-only mode. And so you couldn't be overwritten at that point in time. And to me, that's immutable. And so we can use the software layer of immutability with our backup targets, or even cloud backup targets, to say that, okay, the last 10 days that's been written to here can never be touched. It can't be overwritten. And so we have that ability to take and recover. The next thing here is don't just restore, because if the bad guys are in, you're going to be restoring, and that could trigger escalations with the bad guys, because they're thinking that they're not going to be getting paid. They probably still have command and control access inside of your infrastructure somewhere. You probably don't know exactly where it is, because they already got in and they already ransomed you. And so don't just start restoring. You need to figure out the next steps first. And so my advice here is that if you do want to start restoring, go and grab some of your extra gear that you've got, build a greenfields offline environment, and start restoring that offline. In regards to like your cyber insurance vendors and all of that stuff, you're actually allowed to work in parallel to them. So they could take a week or more to figure out what's going on, but that doesn't necessarily stop you from rebuilding parallel infrastructure and having your IT teams working. You can be restoring that into an alternate environment and getting your business back up and running and operational. Okay, so John, the next one here is that there has to be something that triggered in your advanced threat protection. And if you don't have some type of advanced threat protection, there's so many vendors out there. I don't like to get into the whole vendor discussion here, but there's so many vendors out there that can help you with this. You need advanced threat protection. Something had to have been triggered. And so, you're going to be digging through those alerts, digging through something had to have triggered in there along the way. And in a lot of cases, John, what I found in organizations when ransomware even gets through with advanced threat protection, somebody's not watching those alerts all that closely, because maybe there's a lot of noise in there and they thought, oh, well, that doesn't look that serious. And so now what I found with a lot of these ATP vendors that are out there, they're actually putting in the alert active ransomware attack in flight, so that it can have an escalation path. And if you can have triggering events like that in your system, if alerts like that come up, make sure that you take and that you have that escalating immediately, okay? And then the other thing is that a lot of these vendors that have advanced threat protection have the ability to have their own threat experts that can help you analyze what's going on. So, John, I'll throw this one back to you quickly, and then I see some more questions coming in, so I'm going to check the questions.
The one thing I'm going to mention is the point about don't be scared to over-isolate. Remember what I said earlier. Isolate immediately, then analyze, then remediate. And, the example I give everybody is not too long ago, I was working on an Exchange server that happened to, it had the management tools installed, and I was testing some things, so I was running some remote PowerShell, and it flagged an alert in our advanced threat protection, right? Because remote PowerShell can be very powerful and very misused. And it flagged under my account, but our security administrator did exactly what they were supposed to do and absolutely the right thing. They locked my account out. Okay? And so, I'm the highest level IT executive, but yet my account is locked out. And they were very nervous when they came to me, and all I could do is I could say, I thank you. Thank you very much. You did the right thing. Even though it was absolutely benign, you're going to let me back in. I was locked out for a few minutes. So what? That is way better than if it had actually been an attacker and you let them loose for 4 or 5 minutes while you tracked me down and found this out. We'd be looking at a very different scenario. So do not be afraid to over-isolate.
All right, so now that you've found the alert inside of the system, John, there's something called threat hunting. And so from a Microsoft standpoint, I know you and I are very big Microsoft fanboys because that's the world and the space that we live in. What can you do with threat hunting? Like, I need to figure out basically how bad is this? Did this touch all my workstations? Did this get into all of my servers? Did they get access to like network switches or IoT devices? Threat hunting is your friend, right, John? Like, you can almost instantly get that data back by using the inbound threat hunting engines that are built into those ATP agents, right?
Absolutely. And, when it comes to threat hunting, having extra value-added services like the Microsoft Threat Experts on demand, that can be very expensive. People think, oh, wow, that's a lot of money. We can't afford that. But what they don't realize is that you should be keeping track of all the investments you're making in cybersecurity, whether that be capital purchases or capital equipment like switches or new servers, that kind of thing, or whether it be subscription services like Threat Experts or that sort of thing. Because during your renewal process, showing that level of investment will at minimum, more than likely, reduce the premium you pay and allow you to get the level of coverages that you want. But in many cases, it will actually also reduce the premium enough to offset the cost of having it. I have seen people spend $60,000 on an investment and it dropped their annual premium by $85,000. So essentially they were paid $25,000 or whatever the math works out to be to use that technology. How great is that?
Oh, that's an amazing tip. Amazing tip. Okay. So I just have one more question that came in, John, then we'll tackle this one. Malcolm had a question. Is there any recovery without having to pay ransom? And so, yeah, absolutely, Malcolm. So some of the keys inside of here to being able to recover is making sure that you have an environment set up that is what I'll call safe to recover from ransomware. So having that concept or that utopia of a single domain and having all of your hypervisors living inside of the same domain, all your backup targets living inside the same domain, makes it very easy for the bad guys to get in because now they have one basically plane that they have to attack and get access to do a lot of damage. So if you build a secure guarded fabric, which is basically nothing more than a separate Active Directory domain enforced, and that's where you run all the hypervisors, and you build yourself out like a cloud-like environment, recoverability is totally possible. The clients, almost 100% of those that I've seen that have had to pay, don't have that type of a setup. They have a setup where everything is very flat, okay? Okay, reviewing your cloud or cyber DR and BCP plans. This is something that I wanted to throw in, and we'll just really quickly speak to this because we talked about this earlier, John. This is not a set it and forget it, okay? You almost need dedicated DR and BCP professionals inside of your team that this is their day job, because the threat landscape changes so much. This is not write that document and put it on the shelf and forget about it until next year. This is a living document. What is your advice for individuals that are attending today to keeping that cyber DR and BCP plan up to date? Do you have your teams look at this annually, John, or is it like, what do you do? What's the advice that you have for those professionals looking after this?
So the first thing that I do and I recommend is that you really need to look at if the people resources you have devoted to your DR system are enough, right? A lot of times it's just thrown on as an extra duty to somebody who's already taking on too much, and that is a huge risk when bad things happen. So look at that and make sure you got enough resources. And that leads me into the next part to your actual question is I have a section of the DR plan tested weekly. And what I mean by that is often the DR plan requires a lot of different types of restores, everything from workstations to files and all the way up to, full servers with virtual machine disk files, virtual disk files, that sort of thing, or SQL servers, Exchange servers. So there's lots of different types in here. And what we do is we test a section of them once a week. We have so many areas that what that ultimately comes down to is we end up with a full test of everything in our DR plan at least once a quarter. And a lot of people think that's extreme. And I go back to that statement I made when we were talking about the first slide. My strategy at this point is to keep us to where our downtime is minutes and hours, not days, weeks, and months.
Awesome. Another question that came in from Victor here. Are there any organizations, third parties, that create air-gap backups as part of their own services? Yes, absolutely, Victor. I won't go into naming names, but if you just go search for this, depending on who, the backup vendor of your choice is, take a look at who their partners are that provide these cloud-based services. It is 100% an option for you to outsource that. And there's even some very big organizations that can help you with that. But yes, that is totally, almost every backup vendor has that capability.
And Victor, use the word immutable in your search. You'll find a lot.
Absolutely. So now, John, we've gone through a very bad day here, very bad week, very bad month. And, we're not confident at this point in time that, just running malware scans has gotten the bad guys out of our infrastructure. Are we in a wipe reload? Are we looking at bare metal imaging, autopilot, something that we can take and go run around to all of those workstations and get them back to a known, safe, steady state? So the cyber insurance guys have come in, you're a week gone, you figured out where it came from. There was a phishing email that came in, and somebody had elevated rights on a laptop for whatever reasons, and they got access to that laptop. They loaded up some keystroke loggers on there. They were able to take and gain admin credential access by, get this, and this is actually a real scenario, John. The bad guys got into a laptop, got admin access. It was a finance person that the laptop that they had. They were messing around with the laptop to make it so that they had to cut a service desk ticket. And then what ended up happening was they got the service desk to come in who had domain admins access to everything to log into that system, but they were harvesting credentials on that box, and boom, that's how they got domain admins. Okay, so now they had access to everything. So now it was determined that it came in. That's what forensics pointed us to. We even got down to the email, and great. So now we have to decide whether or not we trust any of those systems that are out there. So one of the things I recommend, and I won't spend too much time on the slide because we've got more content that I want to go through, My advice to everybody is I want you to test a plan where you can quickly re-image the infrastructure in the event of cyber or ransom DR, and this should be part of your BCP plan as well. So in the event that you think that there could be compromise at some type of admin level, you need a strategy to re-image those devices to make sure that things are clean so that when they're brought back into the network, you're not just going to go reinfect, okay? And so that strategy should be done not after you've gotten the ransomware attack. That should be planned right now and model the fact that, okay, it is a ransom event and we did have to do this. So either bare metal imaging or something like that, okay? We talked about how long this can take already, John, so we won't beat this one to death, but just be prepared. When you're ransomed, it is not a fast process from a recovery perspective. You're talking, typically weeks, if not months, from a recovery, and hopefully you've had systems in place that will take and help you get critical systems back up and running and operational quickly, because, people need to get paid. And the bad guys are really smart when they trigger this stuff, because most of the events happen just before month end or just before mid-month when payroll cycles or vendor payables are due. And so, that is very impactful to the business. And so those are typically the types of systems we want to look at getting back up and running. If you did have offline or air-gap backups of your accounting data, you might want to consider hosting that in a cloud solution temporarily so you can gain access to running that. And I've also seen people that have already outsourced payroll services just keep running the same payroll amounts just so that they can get individuals paid because they have no other way to do it. So they just run the same set of EFTs to their payroll vendors. We had a question earlier, John, about the notification. So we covered this with the Privacy Commissioner and the FBI. So yes, you probably got responsibilities there. And we'll probably cover one or two more points here, and then we're done. We're doing really well with what we're doing here. One of the things, we had a question. Can you get away without having to pay, or do you always have to pay? This is such a great question, and so many different ways that we could look at this, John. And so for me, the first thing you have to do is assess what they got. What did they get their hands on? How much data was exfiltrated? Did you check your firewall logs to see the 40 terabytes of data that was sucked off your file servers? Do you know what it is that they actually went through and accessed and pulled off of there? Was that confidential or intellectual property for your business? Are your designs now going to another country and being built in a manner that, could seriously put your business in jeopardy? So I call that the type of ransomware-less attack, where they're just going after data because it's too much work to lock everything down. And we know that data is digital currency today. And so, that could be one of your triggering factors, whether or not you want to pay or not, because maybe you don't want that information released. Maybe that's top secret information if you're a government agency. Government agencies typically deal with this in a different fashion, but, those are some of the things that you really have to look at when you're taking a look at this. It's like you have to assess at this point in time what was lost, right? All right, so this next one here is for you, John. Plugging the holes. So now you've gone through the event, you've notified cyber, you've re-imaged machines, you're back up and running. It's all for naught if you don't come back around full circle and plug the holes in the first place. Are you running open-ended RDP with no MFA and not locking down IP addresses on the internet? Because that's one of the easiest ways for bad guys to get in. You have to go through a serious assessment and reality check to see how they got in and how you could potentially stop it. So, John, we've got this one here, and then we've got one more final closing thought. So 60 seconds, John. How do you deal with plugging holes?
So the strategy that I recommend here is realize that you need to sit down and honestly look at everything across your ecosystem and clearly define and prove what you're going to do different. Because, you had an event and you got those systems back up and you got your cyber insurance to pay. Well, guess what? Your cyber insurance carrier isn't just going to renew the policy like nothing ever happened. They're going to want to see how you changed not only your implementations, but your policies, procedures, best practices, and all those kind of things. So you need to not only be able to articulate that, but you need to be able to document it, maybe take some photos of some changes, some screenshots, that kind of thing, and be prepared to provide all of that to your insurance carrier, to your internal auditors, if you're a public organization, to your external auditors, because they are going to look much deeper, and saying that you're just doing the same things you always did is not going to be the answer they want to hear.
No, absolutely. And one final closing thought here, John, is waiting for them to come back, right? So threat actors are not nice guys. There's a strong likelihood they're going to come back. So as you said, plugging those holes is just so important for us. And the last closing thought here is this: invest in cyber defense, everyone. You're not going to get fired for taking and having too much security in today's day and age. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Chris. What a fantastic session, John. Thank you so much. Thanks for all of the questions and the questions that we've had coming through. Very interactive session. And you've got more great content coming up. So from John and myself, thank you guys very much for attending today.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk, Dave and John. That hour flew by. Everyone stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, the current ransomware landscape, a 50-minute overview. Take a chance to check out those resources on your console provided by Rubrik, and we'll be right back.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the Enterprise Ransomware and Recovery Summit. This event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine and Virtualization and Cloud Review, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsor, Rubrik, for making this event possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of the Converge 360 Group of 1105 Media, and I'll be your moderator for the second of our 3 information-packed sessions. But before we get started, a quick reminder that each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way within the next few days. This session will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Our sponsor has provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. And during our third session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a Rad Mission 1 electric hybrid bike, a super cool Metro bike from Rad Power Bikes, optimized for urban riding. But you got to be with us to win, so stick around. Now let's get started with our second session, the current ransomware landscape, a 50-minute overview. For this session, we've called on Alan Liska, intelligence analyst for Recorded Future. Alan has seen firsthand the damage ransomware attacks can cause and how ransomware actors operate and communicate with each other. He has written many articles about ransomware and regularly appears on the PBS NewsHour, CNN, ABC, NBC, and CBS, and he's quoted in virtually all of the leading print publications. He's also the author of The Practice of Network Security, Building an Intelligence-Led Security Program, and Security NTP, a Quick Start Guide. And he was one of our most popular guests on my Waters Works podcast. So I'm really glad to have him with us today. You're in for a great session. Take it away, Alan.
Yeah, so before I get started, John, quick question. Are speakers and moderators eligible to be entered to win the bike?
They should be. I want this bike.
Thank you for having me today, and thank you all for attending. I really appreciate it, and love these sessions because the questions are always so fantastic. So I'm going to talk to you all a little bit today about where we are, where we stand with the ransomware landscape. It's actually changed a lot in the last 6 months, so there's a lot going on to talk about. So far this year, we've seen more than 1,500 victims posted to ransomware extortion sites. Interestingly, that's actually down from 2021, but don't start rejoicing and thinking that ransomware is over. We're not actually sure what that means. A lot of ransomware actors are starting to skip the extortion site in favor of other kinds of extortion. While we also, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, while we're also seeing some ransomware groups that are skipping the encryption part and just jumping right to the extortion sites. So extortion sites have become a less reliable metric of the number of ransomware attacks, but it is a number that we can all share and agree on. And as you can see, ransomware attacks in the bottom chart here have been kind of ups and down this year. We saw a pretty big dip in attacks in January and the early part of February that coincided with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Normally we do see a slowdown in January because ransomware groups like to take an extended break for Christmas. Lucky them, I guess. But this slowdown really lasted a lot longer than we expected. Then they jumped back up in March and April, and we're down again in June, and they still seem to be down a little bit in July. But again, ransomware extortion sites have gotten weird as a metric. We have also in the last 12 months seen 30 law enforcement actions taken against ransomware groups. Some really good activity, including clawing money back from ransomware actors, so clawing ransomware payments that were made. Governments taking offensive action against ransomware infrastructure and shutting it down, and then a number of arrests. We're also seeing an interesting change in which countries are being targeted. Basically, a lot more countries are being targeted. If you go back to 2020, between the United States and Canada, that accounted for more than 60% of all ransomware victims. And now that number in 2022 so far is less than 45%. And that's because ransomware actors are diversifying their targets, not just in terms of the businesses they're going after, but they're starting to look at other countries as well and realizing they can still make money going to other countries. And so that's where we're seeing a lot of focus in other parts of the world. And that that trend will continue. The USA, unfortunately, is always going to be a big target for ransomware groups, but that target will continue to get smaller and smaller as other countries become of interest. And so it's not enough for for me to say, oh, hey, there's law enforcement action being taken against ransomware groups. We're actually prosecuting and bringing ransomware actors to justice through trials. So we have, back in March, we have one of the Southern Akivi Revo ransomware defendants was extradited to the U.S. and is in trial in Texas. Another one was extradited from Canada, part of the NetWalker ransomware, and also under trial. So that's good. And it goes to show when we talk about ransomware, we talk an awful lot about Russia and how a lot of these ransomware groups in Russia just simply can't be touched because they're protected by the Russian government. But not every member of every ransomware group is in Russia. A lot of the initial access brokers, a lot of the affiliates are located around the world. And with the 30-country ransomware task force that President Biden has set up, there's a lot more cooperation between countries, a lot more intelligence sharing, which means that we're not only able to identify and issue indictments for these ransomware actors that are outside of Russia, we're also able to actually bring them to justice and put them on trial. And so we expect to see more of that going forward as the as the information sharing between these countries and the ransomware task force continues to grow and gets built out. And I say that and then also say don't count on ransomware attacks slowing down anytime soon, because it takes a while, and everybody hates to hear that, but it takes a while for law enforcement to really start showing that impact. We're talking often years to build cases and get that. But But I like to kind of compare it to whack-a-mole because that's the analogy that we use in information security when we talk about arrests or indictments against ransomware actors, that you knock one down and one pops up. But here's the thing, if you go to Coney Island and you play whack-a-mole at Coney Island once or twice a year, you're never going to get that good at it. If you want to be a professional whack-a-mole player, and since there's professional cornhole, I am sure somewhere there's a professional whack-a-mole league. If you want to get good at it, you have to go daily or weekly to play whack-a-mole, and then you can get a lot better at it. And that's what we're seeing law enforcement doing now, is by continuing this activity, by continuing engagement and indictments and everything else that they've been doing to go after ransomware groups, they're getting better, they're getting faster, and they're getting more reactive. And that's a good thing, and we should start to see more of that have an impact on ransomware groups going forward. The other big thing that we're seeing is a change in tactics by ransomware groups. So since January 1st, we've seen 74 new ransomware variants. That is a huge number. We've never seen, since roughly 2015, we haven't seen this many new ransomware variants pop up in such a short space. And the reason for that is that what happened earlier this year, so for those of you that don't know, one of the biggest ransomware groups out there was Conti. Conti, when Russia invaded Ukraine, declared full-throated support for Russia, and that really, really pissed off a lot of their affiliates. And more importantly, it pissed off a Ukrainian security researcher who infiltrated their infrastructure and leaked all of their chats, leaked all of their infrastructure information, leaked a whole bunch of data, and created a whole bunch of chaos. And what a lot of the ransomware affiliates from the Conti incident and from what's going on with law enforcement are starting to realize is that being part of a big ransomware group is probably not a good idea, because the big ransomware groups tend to be targeted by law enforcement. So this RAS model, this ransomware as a service model that's built up over the last couple of years, where everybody's kind of flocked to it, is starting to fall out of favor. Now, this is very, very early on. This may not turn into be a trend. So, I'm not saying that RAS is over, because last month, Lockbit still, which is a RAS group, still accounted for by far the most number of ransomware infections. So what we're seeing this, but we are still seeing this noted trend of ransomware actors moving away from the big RAS groups and kind of starting their own. And part of that is because there's so much code that's freely available. So you have Chaos ransomware code that's leaked. You have the Conti ransomware code that's leaked. You've had Revil ransomware code that's leaked. So if I'm an affiliate, I don't have to build my own ransomware. I can just steal somebody else's code because it's out there and freely available, and I can have my own control panel, and I can do everything that I could do as part of a RAS group. I just don't have to share with the RAS operator anymore. So there is definitely some appeal to that. Yes, you're going to carry out fewer attacks than you would as part of a larger RAS group, but you can still make quite a lot of money doing that. And so we'll see if that continues to evolve into a trend, or if that's just, small groups testing the waters and deciding what they want to do. We're also seeing ransomware go global. We're seeing more ransomware out of Iran, China, UK and Brazil with Lapsus, and with North Korea. So in the last year, we've seen 3 different ransomware variants that have been specifically tied to North Korea and North Korean actors. Now, these are, with North Korea at least, these are state-sponsored actors carrying out cybercrime attacks. There is no criminal underground to speak of in North Korea, cyber criminal underground to speak of in North Korea. There is in China, there is in Iran, and there certainly is in Brazil. But North Korea, if you're carrying out a cyber attack, you are working for the government, or you will be working for the government very shortly. So And this is interesting because those of you that have been around for a while know that North Korea was behind the WannaCry ransomware in 2017, and they were early on. They were very active. I shouldn't say very. They were active in carrying out ransomware campaigns, but they kind of fell off the map a little bit. And then starting in 2021 with first the Maui ransomware, then the Holy Ghost ransomware, and then the VHD ransomware, they've become much more active. Still a small part of overall ransomware campaigns compared to what's going on in Russia, but much more active, much more present out there. Maui ransomware going after specifically healthcare providers. Holy Ghost ransomware tends to go after small and medium-sized businesses. So think of dentist office or real estate offices or auto dealerships where you're talking about $50,000 or $100,000 ransoms. Not a lot compared to ransoms collected by some of the Russian groups, but obviously very devastating for these small businesses. So, kind of two different markets and two different ways of going after them. And one thing that is really interesting about the North Korean ransomware is North Korea is a sanctioned entity. So if you pay a ransom to one of these ransomware groups that are coming out of North Korea, you're likely going to get fined, or at least you'll have to have a conversation with the government about why you paid the ransom. You may not get fined, but that is a real concern. And same thing with ransomware coming out of Iran, where again, a sanctioned entity, you could wind up having to pay a ransom or pay a fine if you pay a ransom to an Iranian ransomware actor. On the other hand, the Department of Justice and the FBI has gotten a lot better at working with victims. I tell people all the time something I used to never do. Hey, if you're hit with ransomware, definitely call law enforcement. Check with your lawyer first before doing anything. But if you reach out to law enforcement, you see things like this. Department of Justice was able to seize $500,000 worth of Bitcoin from North Korean hackers behind the Maui ransomware. And that is because those entities that were hit went to the FBI. They called the FBI. They called them early enough that the FBI was able to work through their legal methods to get that money back. And they can't always do that. It depends on how quickly the money is laundered. It depends on what Bitcoin exchange you're paying into, and so on. But when they can, they will get that money back for you. So if you are hit by a North Korean ransomware group or by an Iranian ransomware group, seriously consider calling law enforcement and working with them to hopefully help improve your outcome. But again, and I mentioned this earlier, we're also seeing the growth of extortion-only ransomware groups. So Mandiant refers to these as multifaceted extortion groups. We tend to still lump them in with ransomware groups because they're doing the same thing. They're just not doing the encryption. Many organizations have built defenses around what to do when all your data is encrypted, but they haven't really built up the defenses to deal with the expanded extortion ecosystem. And that is an area of constant growth and development by these ransomware groups. So, we're used to, okay, I've encrypted files, you have to pay a ransom, or I've encrypted files and I've published them to my extortion site. And but the extortion ecosystem has grown to be so much bigger, from carrying out DDoS attacks, false media amplification, so getting stories about the ransomware attack retweeted on Twitter or in other places to get more media attention, reaching out directly to your clients or to your customers saying, hey, they were hit by a ransomware attack. You sure you want to do business with them? That we know they now look for M&A activity, and if somebody's trying to buy your organization, they'll reach out to people buying and say, hey, did you know they were hit by a ransomware attack? So they're really looking at ways to ramp up those levels of extortion and coerce payment out of there in whatever method they need to do in order to in order to get that money from you, they will find a way to do that. So again, we're seeing a lot of growth in that area. And one of the things that, again, a lot of organizations have not accounted for is how to handle that, right? Like, because that's not necessarily a technical solution. We in security tend to focus on the technical solutions. Okay, here's how I can stop the ransomware actor, or here's how I can recover the files once they've been encrypted. Here's what we need to do. Here's the process, and so on. But that sort of secondary, tertiary, et cetera, extortion that happens, that's much more chaotic. And you need to have a plan for addressing that ahead of time. Just like you need to have a plan for recovering from a traditional ransomware attack, you need to have a plan for dealing with that extended extortion ecosystem before you're hit with an attack. We have, you really need to sit down with your communications people and your, PR people and your leadership and say, okay, what happens if sensitive files are published? What happens if our customers are getting called by the ransomware group? What happens if our business partners are getting called? So you need to have a communications plan in place. You need to have a way of addressing these issues, and you really want to do it before the ransomware attack happens. So what does a modern ransomware attack look like? It looks like this, and I know this is kind of a mess, so I'm going to kind of walk you through it, and then we're going to dive into a couple of things on here. So initial access is generally carried out by initial access brokers. Most ransomware groups, not all, but most ransomware groups don't actually carry out the initial access themselves. Instead, they rely on other people to carry out the initial access, and then the ransomware actor will either buy that initial access, or they'll have what's called an initial access broker that works for them. And that person, their sole job is to go around and find victims all day, infect those victims, and then turn the new network over to the people who carry out the ransomware attack. How do they get in? We see a lot of phishing attacks still. Last year, we definitely saw more credential stuffing and credential reuse attacks than we did phishing attacks. Now, that's our view. Different companies have different views. Some companies will tell you they see a lot more phishing. What we see is we saw a lot more credential stuffing and credential reuse attacks. So there are literally billions of stolen credentials available, often for free, on underground markets. The ransomware actors will find those, and they will publish that information, or the ransomware actors will find those. They'll find your systems that are exposed on your network that they can log into, and then they'll keep trying those accounts till they find one that will work. Alternatively, they'll find like an open remote desktop protocol, so RDP system on the network. They know that there's likely an administrator account, and they'll log in with that administrator account, and they'll try the top whatever million passwords or whatever in order to gain access. So credential stuffing is really popular because it's cheap and easy to do. Anybody with a laptop can start carrying out scanning for vulnerable systems and then finding credentials and shove them in. So you don't have to pay for phishing infrastructure or anything like that. We also see exploitation for initial access. Generally not 0 days. I know there's some concern about that, but for the most part, the number of ransomware actors going after 0 days is very, very, very small. Mostly it's known vulnerabilities that they found an exploit for, or somebody else most likely has published an exploit for, and they're just taking advantage of that. So they will scan. VPN concentrators are very popular. Anything from Sophos, Pulse Secure, Fortinet, SonicWall. Any of those vulnerabilities have been exploited over and over again, so that's one way to get in. We also saw a big jump last year in the use of third parties. So what happens is the ransomware actor lands into a network realizes that network has some really good connections to other networks. So rather than ransom them, they will use those connections to jump into the over the trusted connection to those partner networks. And generally, when you land right in the GUI center, and so it's much easier to launch your ransomware attack. We're also seeing some ransomware actors who are very interested in insider threats. So we've seen like Lockbit publicly advertise, hey, here's our email address. If you're dissatisfied with your company, we'll give you money to install to install a loader for us so we can carry out a ransomware attack. The good news is, to the best of my knowledge, we haven't seen any of these successfully carried out. We know, like last year, they tried to do that with Tesla. They offered an employee $1 million, and he turned them over to the FBI instead. But just because they haven't done it successfully yet doesn't mean they won't eventually, so it is something you should start thinking about. Once they've landed in the network, then you have reconnaissance and lateral movement. So we see ransomware actors using the same tools over and over again, PSExec, Cobalt Strike. We're starting to see some Sliver in there as well. Metasploit, AdFind, Mimikatz, Bloodhound. They're looking basically for ways to jump from machine to machine and get the credentials they need, because eventually they want to get to your Active Directory server, your domain controller. So that is the ultimate goal, is trying to get to there. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. Ransomware actors aren't just interested in Windows machines anymore. They're also interested in Linux, and especially in ESXi-based servers. If they can take out your whole internal data center, they can probably get a lot more money. So they're really looking at ways to better encrypt those. Once they've gotten all the accesses they need, then exfiltration is next. They love to take as many files as they can, send them up. Then you see the deployment of the ransomware itself. So they go ahead and deploy the ransomware. And then you have the extortion. And I consider extortion to be part of the attack phase because it's intimately tied to ransomware. So whether it's because they're demanding money to decrypt your files or carrying out one of the other ransomware ecosystem, extortion ecosystem attacks, or if they don't get any money from that way, selling your stolen data. So I do want to kind of dive into, because the extortion ecosystem has become so important, I do want to dive a little bit into ransomware and the multifaceted extortion groups, because they're using the same set of data, same set of tools to exfil your data. We see these tools used over and over again: WinSAP, rClone, Megasync, 7-Zip, SteelBit. Now, there are legitimate uses for most of these tools as well. But if they're not tools that are commonly used in your network, I do highly, highly recommend looking for those file hashes, not just for the current version, but for previous versions, or on your desktop endpoint and server systems. Excuse me. And what I mean is, like, for example, if you have an EDR, so if you're using a Carbon Black or a Sentinel-1 or something like that, load those hashes up and just alert anytime any of these any of these applications show up on a desktop. There's a chance that it may be a ransomware group. I will tell you to be careful with 7-Zip if you're using Zoom in your network, because part of the Zoom loader is based on 7-Zip code, and you may wind up flagging false positives every time somebody logs into a Zoom meeting. But other than that, a lot of these other tools, again, if you are not using them in your network and it's not part of your standard application stack, looking for them and alerting whenever you see one in use in the network may help you spot either a ransomware group or an extortion group. We also know that a lot of ransomware groups love to use Mega.io. Mega.io is a file sharing service. Ransomware groups love it because they take payment in Bitcoin, and so they can pay for a Mega.io account. There are about a dozen domains associated with Mega.io, like Mega.nz and a few others. If that is not a service that you have authorized for file sharing, block that out of your network. It won't necessarily stop a ransomware group from exfilling files, because we'll just set up a CNC server and move that. But it at least gives you an early alert that, hey, somebody might be doing something shady in your network. So if you block mega.io and all of its associated domains, again, if you're not using it for legitimate purposes and it's not authorized for employees to share files or anything, that can be a quick way to identify this type of malicious activity and this type of data theft coming out of your network. And again, start running tabletop exercises now for how you deal with a data extortion problem. Think about your plan for communicating with employees, clients, and the general public. Determine what is your most sensitive data and what will you do if that leaks, up to including, does that mean we have to pay the ransom, but also understanding that just because you paid the ransom doesn't mean that data is really gone. Ransomware actors will straight up lie to your face and say they've secure deleted the data, but they haven't. They're looking to sell it to somebody because they know if you're willing to pay for it, somebody else is too. What are you going to do when they start calling your clients? What if they reach out to the press and the press calls you? We see that all the time where ransomware actors will email people in cybersecurity press and say, hey, I got a hold of this account and they're not paying me. And then, the reporter, if it's a big enough story, the reporter will call and say, hey, what's happening? What are you going to say then? And then what if, as with North Korea, what if the group is in a sanctioned country, or if it's a sanctioned ransomware group? So some like Evil Corp are sanctioned cyber criminal groups, and so paying them can also result in a fine. You're probably already doing tabletop exercises for how you're going to defend against ransomware, and I encourage those. It's great to do that. We'd love to see those that kind of activity. Really, really consider throwing in how this works. I'll give you an example. I was working with a hospital that had gotten hit with a ransomware attack. They had contained the attack, so the attacker didn't get a chance to deploy the ransomware. They caught them during the reconnaissance phase, and it come in from a third party. They stopped it, but they had to shut down part of their systems just to make sure that they actually cleaned everything up. So they were doing everything right. They didn't tell the help desk what they were doing. So the help desk was working with rumors. One of the healthcare provider's partners called, talked to somebody in the help desk, and who said, "Oh, we have a ransomware attack." So the partner cut them off, and understandably, they cut them off because they didn't want the ransomware actor jumping from the hospital network to their network, and we see that often. We often see when it's known that there was a ransomware attack, the vendors will get cut off, and the vendors will cut off the victim until everything's under control. So while the CISO was trying to resolve what turned out to be a very successful incident response, they had to stop everything they were doing and call this vendor and actually explain what was happening and get them to reconnect service. So it just took away from their ability to effectively respond to something that had already been fairly well contained. And that's why that internal communication is really important. I know your lawyer is going to tell you not to share too much information, but you want to share enough that you're not going to get cut off. Or at least tell the help desk people, oh, if you have a question, let me have you talk to so-and-so and have a point of contact for communication. You may not want to share the whole story with everybody at the help desk, but you can at least tell them, oh, have them call me and I will respond to all of these. So going back to what I was saying earlier, we're seeing more and more ransomware groups also go after Linux and VMware ESXi. It's become a really, really important tactic for those ransomware groups that are still engaging in encryption, which is most of them. I just want to be clear on that. So there's probably 24 different ransomware groups that have not just Windows, but also have Linux and ESXi. And ESXi is particularly challenging because often we've seen where the ransomware actors don't do things like properly shut down the virtual machines before they encrypt them. They just straight up encrypt everything. And that means those virtual machines can become corrupted, or they encrypt them, and it turns out they're too big to be decrypted. So we've seen that before, where because of the way some ransomware groups encrypt files, you can't always decrypt them if they're bigger than 4 gigs, which a lot of virtual images, a lot of VMs are. So you really have to be extra cautious with your ESXi and your Linux systems. And unfortunately, with ESXi, we've seen ransomware actors, 4 different vulnerabilities that were announced by ESXi over the last year. We've seen them take advantage and exploit those. So oftentimes, they're not even moving around from machine to machine to get to there. They find the ESXi machine, they take advantage of an unpatched vulnerability, and then they get in and encrypt everything. Again, same thing with Linux. They know that these systems are super critical to. They know these systems are super critical to a lot of organizations, and so they know it's really important for them to be able to encrypt them, and you're much more likely to get paid if you've taken out their victim server infrastructure, and so that is why they do that. And that's not just your internal cloud, but any external clouds. If you have a direct connection to your cloud provider that they can make a quick jump to across the network, they will encrypt those systems. So again, that is that is an area of concern, and it's an area where there's often not as much security. A lot of people don't put endpoint protection or EDR or EDX solutions on their Linux or ESXi servers, so ransomware actors can often move around there sort of unimpeded because they don't have any of the security tools that are on the Windows machines. So again, just keep that in mind. Take steps to protect yourself from these, from these kind of activities and this kind of action. And that is, again, when you're hunting for ransomware actors, catching them during the reconnaissance phase is so important. You want to look for some of the tools that they're using. So again, I mentioned Cobalt Strike, Sliver, AdFind, Mimikatz, Bloodhound, AdRecon. There are a lot of great Yara rules and Stigma rules that are freely available for organizations. So if you have some kind of EDR, or if you have a managed service provider that has EDR or XDR that they're using, taking advantage of those available Yara rules and Sigma rules to help find some of these things being used in your network. Oftentimes, the worst thing that happens if you find it is you capture the red team trying to do reconnaissance, and that's great. But, most of the time it's going to be somebody doing something bad, most often a ransomware actor, but we even see nation states and other groups taking advantage of these tools. The other thing that I unfortunately don't see enough of, that we really need to see much, much more of, is PowerShell logging. Too many organizations don't log PowerShell, and ransomware actors love their PowerShell. They really, really do. So anything that you can do to enable PowerShell logging is really important. And I know it's easy for me to sit up here and say, enable PowerShell logging. No, you down there, you're out there going, yeah, but that's a whole bunch more false positives I have to deal with. That's a whole much more log costs that I have to deal with. And SIMs are not cheap, and I'm already shoving so many logs in there. I'm just going to add to the cost. There really is a lot of value in PowerShell logging. And there are a lot of things that ransomware actors do using PowerShell that you can look for. So disabling and creating new admin accounts. You want to look for new scripts that haven't been previously run, scripts running at odd times. The thing about PowerShell is so many organizations use PowerShell for things in their network already that your detection scheme for how you detect, malicious activity in PowerShell will vary so much from network to network. So what I tell people is always build a baseline of what your PowerShell activity is. And then once you've built that baseline, start looking for things that deviate from that. So things that aren't normally done by your PowerShell scripts or PowerShell scripts running at weird times or on weird systems, things like that. That way, that's one of the easiest ways to start kind of like what we would call threat hunting for malicious PowerShell is just looking for the things that are weird in your network. And only you will know what's weird in your network. And so that is where, again, building that baseline and then this is too different, let's go ahead and investigate that, is a great way to really get into threat hunting and start building those capabilities. We also see that more and more ransomware groups don't like the command line. They love to work from the GUI, and that means that there are a lot of GUI tools that they will download and use as part of their activity. So we see Screen Connect, we see AnyDesk, we see Splashtop, we see all kinds of remote GUI products being used. Again, if you're not using any of these remote desktop GUI products, look for them. Again, if you have an EDR or XDR, look for their hashes and just flag anything that is using them. It may be an employee that's doing it because they want to check something on their home computer, but more likely it's going to be a ransomware or other malicious actor. And it's a great, easy way to catch early activity from the ransomware actors. So I love this as a detection tool. Takes a little bit of work. You have to keep them updated as hashes update, but it's worth it in terms of the things that you can catch with that. So I'm going to wrap this up with kind of where do we stand with ransomware as a little bit over halfway through 2022. Ransomware is global. We still see kind of Russia as the center of control, but we're seeing other countries be much more active. We're seeing a lot of ransomware groups move to an extortion-only model, but still the bulk of ransomware involves encrypting data in the network, but there are more and more groups that are moving to an extortion-only model. We are seeing the ransomware groups that are still engaging in encryption, going after servers as well as desktops, and threat hunting can help your organization with both types of attacks. You can find the actor early in the attack, and you can stop them before they have a chance to do damage. Ransomware is not going away. We were all hoping that when Bitcoin dropped to under $20,000, a Bitcoin, maybe that would discourage ransomware actors to leave. Turns out they just asked for more Bitcoins in their ransom. So it's not going away this year or anytime in the near future. So you still have to plan. You still have to be prepared for it. Once again, thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. I appreciate everybody's time today. I am happy to answer any questions you have. I always love this discussion part of it, so hopefully we can have a good one.
Thank you, Alan. Man, what a scary evolution. I'm
sorry.
Just keeping track of this stuff must keep you busy.
It does. So, John, I think since the last time we talked, I now have 2 interns, literally that their job, one job is just to track the number of incidents. The other one is to spend all day blowing up ransomware and then writing reports on the ransomware they blew up. So, it's a lot, unfortunately.
Oh, man. Well, okay, I just want to remind everybody, you can still type your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. Let's see, what have we got here? So Eric is asking, what are your favorite ransomware tools for backing up Microsoft 365?
I'll be honest with you, cloud backups are not an area of specialty for me, so I don't have a good answer for that. I do know that that Microsoft 365 does a lot of automated backups to sometimes several iterations back. So, John, I'm not sure if you know of any, but no. I don't have a really good answer. I'm sorry.
I saw that Microsoft has come out with what is that feature in Windows 11 that's got that is purported to thwart ransomware with some identity management capability as a default. But I don't know. Every time I listen to you, I just think, how can we even keep ahead of these guys? Anyway, I don't want to take up everybody's question time here. So We've got one here from Vic who wants to know, why do you think there has been an uptick in activity from North Korea?
I'm not a geopolitical expert, so I'm not even going to pretend to get into the mind of Kim Jong-un, and I'm not sure that's a place I'd want to go anyway. But I mean, there's money in ransomware, right? I mean, it's the old, sort of the old adage, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. North Korea is sanctioned by everybody except for China, and they need money, and ransomware is a great way to make money, and we already know that North Korea loves to mess in cryptocurrency, and this is a great way to get their hands on cryptocurrency. So I don't know how successful they've been, but I understand why they would do it from that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's one from Tori. You mentioned tabletop exercises. How often should organizations run those?
How often they should versus what's practical are two kind of very different answers. I always recommend ransomware tabletop exercises twice a year. But I also know getting executives and getting all the different departments that need to be there together can be really hard. So at least once a year, if you can do it twice a year, that's even better. You're going to find a lot more success that way because things change in networks over time. And, anything more than once a year, you're most likely operating with outdated information when you're trying to come up with your response plan.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's one from Vicky. The term threat hunting scares a lot of organizations. Do you have any tips for organizations that want to get started? I guess, and not scare the C-suite?
Yeah, I know. Everything I do is scary. I'm sorry. Start with the basics. Chris Sanders has an amazing threat hunting course that I highly recommend people taking. And, one of the things that he emphasizes with people just getting started with threat hunting is, you don't need a lot of cool, fancy tools. You need to know what the baseline of your network is and what looks different, right? That's how you start threat hunting, is looking for the oddities and then codifying those oddities into detection rules. And that's really a great way, and that allows almost any organization to begin threat hunting because they can say, this is what we were, this is kind of what we were supposed to do, or this is what our network's supposed to look like. This looks weird. And weird is going to be different for every organization out there, but that's fine. You do it the way it makes sense for you, and you kind of get your opportunity to define what is your normal baseline, what's unusual, and act that way. And that's kind of the way I see getting started as a great way to get started.
So I'm going to ask a question of my own. When you talk about this activity, you're tracking what amount to crime families. We talk about Conti and you're talking about we've seen. Do we have it right? Are you saying that we're seeing a lull right now because of the open source, tools that they have, like Lockbit's recent release? What was it, 3.0, ransomware as a service?
Yes.
That people are just saying, hey, everyone wants to work for themselves, right? So they're jumping ship. But do you think this is a long-term trend?
That's a good question, and I don't know whether this is I don't know if this is a long-term trend or if it's just people feel ransomware, affiliates especially, feeling jumpy right now. Because there's a lot of activity going on. There's a lot of law enforcement activity, and I think a lot of them are kind of retreating to their shell and carrying out a smaller number of attacks while they figure out, while the dust settles. We'll see whether or not it winds up being long-term. How many people have said, I'm going out and starting my own business, and then decided it's just easier to work for the man. So we'll see what happens long-term.
We'll see if the failure rate's equal to the failure rate of restaurants. So
right,
we've got
exactly.
another question here from we've got a question here from Quinn. He's referring to what we were talking about earlier. He says, "How busy are you, Alan? Are you getting asked every day to help companies with ransomware intrusions?" We may have a lull, but you don't have a lull, right?
I don't have a lull, no. Now, I don't do incident response anymore. I work in more of an advisory role. So, I'm an old man. I have bad eyesight. You don't want me trying to hunt through, 20,000 lines of logs looking for what happened in your ransomware actor. There are young, smart people that can do that. But yes, I am extremely busy. There's always a ransomware incident I'm asked to advise on. And then and then I do a lot of webinars like this. This is my sixth one this week. Just trying to keep people educated, trying to keep people updated on what's happening with ransomware. So unfortunately, I stay very, very busy all the time. I wish that wasn't the case, but yes, I'm unfortunately very in demand.
It's a fascinatingly dynamic space. Interesting to see how things like the evolution of crypto and when we have the new EU rules and all this, how it affects how the dynamics of this money making model. You know what? I think that's all the questions we have. Thank you, Alan, for another awesome session.
Cool. Yes, thank you very much. As always, I really love it, and I love the great discussion that we have here. So I look forward to talking to you all again.
Thanks, one of my favorite presenters. Well, okay, folks, as I said, that looks like that's all the time we have for. Many, many thanks to Alan Liska, better known as the Ransomware Sommelier, for a great session, and to our sponsor, Rubrik, for making it possible.